Assalamu alaikum and welcome dear CSS aspirants to the 5th session of the distance learning program of the current affairs newspaper breakdown session. So today we are going to discuss the Afghan peace process and the important recent developments that we have seen in the Afghan peace process, especially talking about the 29th February peace deal that was signed between the Taliban and the US representative in Oslo, Norway. So let's begin. So Donald Trump, the American president, was elected in 2016 on a very unique mandate. He's a populist by nature. He's a politician with unconventional politics, and the kind of agenda that he brought forward in his election campaign was to rid America of its unending wars. So he, dubbed them. And one of those unending wars, obviously, is the Afghan war that has been continuing ever since the 2001 US invasion of Afghanistan post the 9/11 debacle. So then, Trump became president for a number of different reasons. Let's not get into that. And then in 2017, Trump for the first time released his foreign policy towards Afghanistan, which was markedly different from what he had promised during his election campaign. So the policy was named the New South Asia Policy, and it was released in quite a sort of vindictive air, where the American administration and Trump in particular, during the announcement of that foreign policy, really blamed Pakistan for a number of things. And it was a very vindictive sort of foreign policy where America blamed Pakistan for playing a double game, for not helping America to the extent that it could and it should, and not preventing the Taliban from seeking sanctuaries in the former Fatah region, and a couple of other allegations. Besides that, Trump also announced greater Indian economic and political role in Afghanistan, which is a really shock to Pakistan, because Pakistan considered that as a national security threat to Pakistan's regional interests and national interests, naturally, right? So in that sort of narrative, it is very important to realize what were the sort of regional politics evolving at that time, and how those regional politics basically impacted this decision, and how this decision was in less than a year basically abandoned. So the New South Asia Policy was not taken positively in Islamabad or in Beijing at all. Instead, there was a lot of diplomatic activity going on in order to thwart the American efforts to bring in India into Afghanistan, to sort of strategically encircle Pakistan from its western and eastern borders, and thus really put Pakistan in a security dilemma, right? So, but the interesting thing is that when the New South Asia Policy was released, basically Pakistan's strategic thinking and Pakistan's foreign policy objective had markedly changed. There was an emerging consensus between all the pillars of the Pakistani state, including the establishment and the armed forces, that Pakistan needs to move away from a foreign policy oriented primarily towards Saudi Arabia when it comes to the Muslim world, and the United States when it comes to the rest of the world, right? So now Pakistan was not ready to completely bow to the pressure put by the United States administration, which is why Pakistan did not really change its attitude towards American efforts in Afghanistan after the announcement of the New South Asia Policy. Also interesting to note is that despite US seeing a greater role for India in Afghanistan, India did not really do that, and there's a very important reason for that, and that's also a part of the regional calculus. So in May 2018, slightly sometime after the New South Asia Policy was launched, basically the Trump administration withdrew America from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also otherwise known as the Iran nuclear deal. So India was primarily using Iran as a base for its operations, its political and economic interests and investments and involvement in Afghanistan. So once the US withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and reimposed those sanctions, what India did was basically completely abandon Iran, where earlier India was investing heavily in Iran's oil industry and other sectors. It was building the Chabahar port network. So now India basically kind of completely withdrew from that. There are three important reasons for that. Number one being that Pakistan had disrupted Indian efforts in Iran by countering and discovering and then bringing down the Kalbushan Jadhav network and challenging the Chabahar port network, and thirdly and most importantly, by Iran being put under American sanctions. India would never want to be under American sanctions. So one of the worst things about the American sanctions is simple. They have effects on those countries who are not the direct recipient of those sanctions, but are basically trading and have economic and political relations with the countries who are under sanctions. So that is why India abandoned Iran. So now it was clear that the new South Asia policy had failed. So now an emerging consensus was building inside Pakistan, inside the entire region, in the Asian heartland, in China, in Russia, in between the Taliban and the Afghan government and Iran as well, that there needs to be a permanent settlement and solution to the Afghan crisis once and for all, and this was the time to do it. So that is when in 2018 basically Trump appointed Zalmay Khalilzad to be the special representative of America to Afghanistan, and that was an important sort of measure which clearly showed that the American administration was serious about reaching a peaceful settlement in Afghanistan. And why the Trump administration agreed to start a comprehensive and a full throttle dialogue process and political process to reach a settlement in Afghanistan? Well, there are two reasons, I believe. The first one, obviously, to fulfill his campaign promises. He's like, enough with the lies, I have told enough lies, so I need to fulfill the promises that I made during my campaign, which was part of his populist agenda, to basically end the policing of the world by the American state, and to get out of unnecessary conflicts, and to end America's unending wars. And secondly, obviously, there were electoral or political interests at home that Trump had to consider, because Trump's domestic policy and economic agenda and pretty much of his foreign policy has to a large extent failed. The economic front was good and successful during Trump's administration up until the coronavirus, because of the policies that were made way before him. He is taking credit where the credit is not due. So anyhow, these are the main reasons. So he wanted something to give to his electoral base to win the elections again that are upcoming in the US very soon. And he thought that Afghanistan was basically the lollipop that he could give to his electorate to win the election again. That is why his efforts have been very forthcoming, and he has given a lot of attention to solving the Afghan crisis once and for all. So to sort of give this message that Pakistan is also willing, ready, and completely on board with restarting the Afghan peace process with a very fresh mandate, what Pakistan did was basically release Mullah Baradar, who had been imprisoned in Pakistan ever since 2010, since he was captured in Karachi, and he was released in October 2018. He went on to become the main negotiator for the Taliban, and the main sort of focal person to bridge the trust deficit between America and the Taliban sort of administration, right? So then thirdly, there was emerging pressure building in the Afghan peace process from Russia and from China, where Russia conducted 3 simultaneous Moscow formats, where Russia only invited the Taliban administration, the Taliban High Council, and the Afghan government was not present at the Moscow format. And that was a clear indication of the idea that the Russian administration wants to end the Afghan crisis once and for all, for a number of reasons, which we shall discover a little later in a stakeholder analysis that I'm going to do a little later. So the second pressure point was coming from Pakistan, China and Afghanistan joint working group, where China also wants to see a sustainable solution in Afghanistan to realize its greater ambitions in Asia in the form of the Belt and Road Initiative, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and its overall economic diplomacy. It wants Afghanistan to become a partner in that, because Afghanistan is an important sort of vessel state between connecting South Asia, Middle East, South Asia and Central Asia, and obviously Central Asia, North Asia and the Far East with the Arabian Sea and the greater Indian Ocean region. So due to these 3 important pressure points, the US became really serious about reaching a peace agreement in Afghanistan, because US really wanted to save its face and exit Afghanistan with some sort of settlement with its tail between its legs, so to speak, so that it can have something to give to its population as a lollipop to win the election again for the Trump administration, right? So the rounds of the Doha dialogue then really started, and there were at least 5 Doha talks round between the Taliban representatives and the US administration, and they were basically facilitated by by Pakistan, because initially the Taliban were absolutely not willing to speak to the US administration, and their first agenda and their first demand was that first the American administration needs to withdraw all its troops before there is ever even any chance of a dialogue between the US and the Taliban. But Pakistan saw to it, and they brought the Taliban onto the table, negotiating table, that is. So let's talk about what the Afghan peace process entails. So first of all, the Taliban demands. So in the Doha process, the Taliban have demanded a number of things. Number one, immediate and full withdrawal of American forces and NATO forces from Afghanistan. Two, closure of all, if not, most American bases in Afghanistan. And three, that we are not going to recognize the Afghan government as a legitimate political entity, and therefore we want a post-Afghan government settlement in Afghanistan where Taliban are the major power brokers. Now let's talk about the US demand. So the US was like, all right, we are also serious about the Afghan peace process, but we need certain assurances from you. First of all, for example, that Afghan soil in a post-Afghan peace process Afghanistan will never be used by a terrorist organization or any kind of a non-state actor to initiate any attacks against any other country around the world. Number one. Number two, that all the gains that had been made by the women of Afghanistan ever since the Afghan government was created in 2004 after the Bonn Agreement, they will not be rolled back under a future Taliban and Afghan government shared power structure, like the way the Taliban did during their Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan from 1996 until 2001, where women completely lost their freedoms. They couldn't even move in the society, and the society created by the Taliban was even more archaic than the Saudi Arabian society. So after all of these, and obviously then there's the third demand by the US, which was that they demanded that you must recognize the Afghan government as a legitimate political entity, and you must talk with them on equal basis, and you must initiate an Afghan-led and an Afghan-owned Intra-Afghan dialogue. And so these were very important demands for the US, and something that it really wanted to do before leaving the Afghan quagmire, so to speak. So then after all of these rounds, some agreements were made, some progress was made. Pakistan was an important player in making that progress possible. And in September 19, Trump administration was secretly going to invite the Taliban representatives who were basically negotiating on behalf of Taliban, such as Mullah Baradar, to Camp David, to sign a Camp David Accords with them. So you must realize the importance of Camp David. Past presidents of the United States have only called upon warring parties and parties in war against the United States or amongst themselves to the Camp David Accord to sign historic and sustainable peace agreements. So that meant that the US felt that it was very close to reaching a sustainable solution in Afghanistan. Whether that was going to happen or not depended on a large extent to Taliban movement and their behavior. And their movement was not up to the mark, because despite signing a ceasefire agreement with the US during the Doha talks, they continued to sort of initiate their violence and brutality and their attacks against the Afghan government and other civilian targets, which was basically, you can think of the Taliban as playing a sort of an optics game, where the Taliban are clearly giving this message to the world that the Taliban are willing the war against United States, and the idea that Afghanistan is a graveyard of superpowers was actively being supported by the Taliban, and they were thinking that yes, we are winning this war, look, they are negotiating with us, and on the other hand we are still continuing to attack their forces and the Afghan forces. So this is a image building sort of thing that was going on with the Taliban, which was something that the US did not agree with, which is why suddenly, actually 2 days before Trump was going to invite the Taliban negotiators to the Camp David, Trump withdrew and temporarily suspended the Afghan peace process, citing the death of 2 American soldiers in an attack by the Taliban in one of the American bases. So Temporarily the peace process was suspended, but everybody knew that this was just a gimmick being played by the Trump administration to gain some ground in the Afghan peace process, because everybody felt that it was quite clear from Trump's administration's behavior that Trump was basically desperate to reach a peace agreement in Afghanistan, which was something that was being exploited to an extent by the Taliban, as I've just told you. So then Pakistan facilitated the restart of the Afghan peace process between the US and Taliban, and this time it was put on the fourth gear, which is why on 29th February 2020 they signed a historic peace deal. Now let's have a look over this peace deal that was signed between the Taliban representatives and the American administration. So America agreed to 14-month phased complete withdrawal of foreign forces from Afghanistan. It also agreed to end sanctions on Taliban leaders and Taliban individuals. It also agreed to close down 5 American bases in Afghanistan in 135 days. Secondly, the Taliban agreed to end the violence and have a continued ceasefire with the Afghan government and the US. Thirdly, the US also demanded that immediately after the ceasefire there should be an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned Intra-Afghan process dialogue, which was to begin on the 10th of March. Unfortunately, that did not happen because of a very important article in the peace deal that was signed between US and Taliban, which was basically that there is going to be a prisoner release from the Afghan government. 5,000 Taliban prisoners will be released, and the Taliban will release 1,000 Afghan government prisoners. But that did not happen. So there's important reasons why that did not evolve. So basically what happens is that the US administration in the last and the most important rounds of the Afghan peace process does not absolutely invite or involve the Afghan government in the peace process, which is why they feel left out, which is why they feel that the US is no longer representing their interest so much as protecting them, which is why immediately after the 29th February agreement, President Ghani refused to release the 5,000 Taliban prisoners. Why? Because the 5,000 Taliban prisoners, you must realize, dear students, is the only bargaining chip that Ghani had against the Taliban, because Ghani realized that if the US were to withdraw tomorrow, it would take less than a week for the Taliban to outrun the Afghan government and end their regime and completely take over Kabul and restore the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, right? So it only had a few bargaining chips, which the US really did give away without much consideration for Afghan government's interests and insecurities, so to speak. So Ghani rejected. So that one of the most important roadblocks in the Afghan peace process and the intra-Afghan dialogue, basically. So the second reason why Ghani refused to release the prisoners and have an intra-Afghan dialogue is because Ghani wants the Taliban to end their relationships with the Pakistan establishment, because Ghani believes that the Taliban continuously gets support, logistical support, intelligence support, funds maybe, and arms from the Pakistan establishment, which helps them to really sort of put pressure on the Afghan government to agree to whatever future settlement the Taliban want at the stake of the Afghan government and the Northern Alliance. that is. So the third important roadblock in the Afghan peace process ever since 29th February is the dual coronation ceremony that happened after the conclusion of the Afghan elections, where Ghani and Abdullah both declared themselves as the winner of the Afghan presidential elections and had parallel coronation ceremonies in the presidential palace of Kabul on the same day. So the Taliban said that if there is infighting within the Afghan government and if you're not serious about starting a dialogue, we don't want the Afghan peace process. We will restart our violence, our attacks against you, as we did in the past. So now it's interesting to note that the US and the Ghani administration, which were on the same side previously, are now finding it hard to find common ground. Why? Because naturally the US wants to reach a peace agreement with the Taliban according to the demands that it has basically, according to the terms that it has coined with the Taliban, which is something that America simply cannot go back on to consider Afghan government's interests and insecurities. So this is why the US announced to end $1 billion support to the Afghan government, and it has also pledged to end even more dollars to the Afghan government if it does not agree to the prisoner release. So it's funny because after the US announced the cut in aid to Afghanistan, President Ghani very stupendously came on media and said that this does not affect the Afghan finances or the Afghan economy, where in reality 78% of Afghans' revenue come from foreign aid, especially the American administration. So the prisoner release, back to it again, Ghani, under pressure from American administration, agreed to release 1,500 prisoners and to have more prisoners released in a phased process if the Taliban agree to the ceasefire and hold their end of the bargain. So let's now do a stakeholders analysis, and this is important. What is Pakistan's stake in Afghanistan? Pakistan wants a peaceful settlement in Afghanistan for a number of reasons. Number one is to contain the insurgency and anti-state activities and terrorist activities that have spilled over from the Afghan civil war and the Afghan conflict into Pakistan. Number two, to end the presence of Islamic State in Khorasan in Afghanistan, which is becoming an important security threat to Pakistan and other regional countries. Number three, to basically reach peaceful settlement in Afghanistan so that any threats to China-Pakistan economic corridor can be thwarted. Number four, to make Afghanistan an important part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and number five, to realize the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, the Kasa 1000 pipeline, and the Iran-Pakistan pipeline as important regional energy projects to reach regional prosperity, right? What is the US interest? So primarily the US interest in the region was basically, if I tell you honestly, was to remain in the region, to have their troops present in the Afghan quagmire indefinitely, which is something that they saw in the new South Asia policy that was released in 2017, but it clearly failed. So now I believe that the US is leaving Afghanistan after losing in negotiations, after losing to the situation evolving in the region and in Afghanistan in particular. So what are the Taliban's interests? What is the stake of Taliban? So Taliban basically want the war to end as well, because they are sick of the war. It's been 19 years and they have lost a lot of their brothers and their sisters and the Afghan population, and the Afghan basically infrastructure and economy and everything has been ravaged beyond recognition, right? So they want a future settlement in Afghanistan where they could perhaps re-establish the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which is something that the US completely rejects and a lot of other European powers also reject. So what does the Afghan government want? And the Afghan government is in the most precarious situation right now because it feels that its interests are not being protected by its historic protector, which is the United States, and it is in quite a pinch because it wants a future settlement in Afghanistan where basically what happens is that the Northern Alliance and the Afghan government end up controlling a major part of the power struggle in future Afghanistan. And similarly, China and Russia's interests in Afghanistan are basically to end the conflict, to remove the US presence from Afghanistan once and for all, to include Afghanistan into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization format, to increase regional connectivity, to allow the Central Asia to access the warm waters, double landlocked Central Asia to access the warm waters of the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean region, to basically access the global trading lanes through Afghanistan. So a lot depends on Afghanistan right now. The foreign policy objectives and the strategic vision of China and Pakistan in the region also depend on reaching a peaceful agreement in Afghanistan. So due to a number of these reasons, the world is paying a lot of attention to the developments that are happening in Afghanistan. So one important question was asked from one of my students. So the question was, what will be the future of Pakistan's foreign policy after a peaceful settlement is reached in Afghanistan? I am going to cover the answer to that question in my next video, and more importantly, I am going to cover United States' relationship with Iran in the 21st century and the Iran nuclear deal. With that, I thank you for listening. Good luck.